Morning, everyone, and welcome to Chesley Baptist Church. Whether you're here in person or joining us online, we're grateful to have you and to be talking about, just a way of life. One of the things that I think that we don't talk enough about within what's called the Christian community is that Jesus called us to a different way of life. And so when he talks in Matthew, the early parts of Matthew, and we're going to get into chapter 20 today, but when it talks about the book of Matthew, Jesus just talks about this kingdom of heaven, and I think that one of the things that I've been really impacted by, especially in my study over the last year, really, has been this idea that there's a way of life, a new system, a new way of life that Jesus is trying to introduce. And I think that we want to keep our systems and just kind of add Jesus into it, or we try to mix things together and keep things under our control. And I think that one of the things that we can look at is there's a different way of life, and Jesus has a fuller way of life that he wants us to live and wants us to experience. And so because of that, we can, our world can be different than it is right now. So anyway, let's jump into, I'm going to read through Matthew chapter 20. It's in the New Testament, the last half of Bible, if you have it there with you. And if you want to just listen instead, if that's easier for you, feel free. So Matthew chapter 20 says this: "For the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of an estate who went out early one morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay the normal daily wage and set them out to work. At 9 o'clock in the morning, he was passing through the marketplace and saw some people standing there doing nothing. So he hired them, telling them he would pay them whatever was right at the end of the day. At noon, again, around 3 o'clock, he did the same thing. At 5 o'clock that evening, he was in town again and saw more people standing around. He asked them, 'Why haven't you been working today?' They replied, 'Because no one hired us.' The owner of the estate told him, 'Then go out and join the others in my vineyard.' That evening, he told the foreman to call the workers in and pay them, beginning with the last workers first. When those who he had hired at 5 o'clock were paid, each received a full day's wage. When those who hired earlier came to get their pay, they assumed they would receive more. But they too were paid a day's wage. When they received their pay, they protested. 'Those people worked only 1 hour, and yet you've paid them just as much as you have paid us and worked all day in scorching heat.' He answered them, 'Friend, I haven't been unfair. Didn't you agree to work all day for the usual wage? Take it and go. I wanted to pay this last worker the same as you. Is it against the law for me to do what I want with my own money? Should you be angry because I am kind?' And so it is that many who are first now will be last then, and those who are last now will be first then." Verse 17, "As Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside privately and told them what was going to happen to him. 'When we get to Jerusalem,' he said, 'the Son of Man will be betrayed, and the leading priests and the teachers of religious law, they will sentence him to die. Then they will hand him over to the Romans to be mocked, whipped, and crucified. But on the third day, he will be raised from the dead.' Then the mother of James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus with her sons. She knelt respectfully to ask a favor. 'What is your request?' he asked. She replied, 'In your kingdom, will you let my 2 sons sit in places of honor next to you, one at your right and the other at your left?' But Jesus told them, 'You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink from the bitter cup of sorrow that I am to drink?' 'Oh, yes,' they replied, 'we are able.' 'You will indeed drink from it,' he told them. 'But I have no right to say who will sit upon the throne next to mine. My Father has prepared those places for me, the ones he has chosen.' When the 10 other disciples heard what James and John had asked, they were indignant. But Jesus called them together and said, 'You know that in this world kings are tyrants and officials lord it over people beneath them. But among you it should be quite different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to become first must become your slave. For even I, the Son of Man, came here not to be served, but to serve others, and to give my life as a ransom for many.' As Jesus and the disciples left the city of Jericho, a huge crowd followed behind him. 2 blind men were sitting beside the road. When they heard that Jesus was coming that way, they began shouting, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." The crowd told them to be quiet, but they only shouted louder, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." Jesus stopped in the road and called, "What do you want me to do for you?" "Lord," they said, "we want to see." Jesus felt sorry for them and touched their eyes. Instantly, they could see. Then they followed him. So in this chapter, we see a few different things, but I spoke a bit about it earlier. There's this new way that Jesus is talking about. And so he goes into this explanation of a new way that goes against human expectation. And he says it in a couple different ways. It's one of those things that he looks at doing in a way that they can understand. He uses some examples. He talks about some different things. But one of the ways he does it is talking about this story of the owner of a vineyard and the vineyard workers. And so he hires people, and here in Ontario, it's different, right? Like daylight is different. We have daylight savings time. It's a whole thing. But when I lived in South America, we were closer to the equator, kind of similar to Israel in a way. And you had daylight hours that were almost the same all year long. And so people would work from dawn until dusk. It wasn't uncommon to see that. And that's kind of the system here. And so, I know this is just kind of a side. This doesn't tie in much to what I think Jesus is trying to teach here. But to understand what was happening, people showed up at the break of dawn to work for this guy. And he said, "I'm going to pay you a fair wage. I'll pay you a day's wage." And so they show up and they start working. And then 3 hours later, he goes and he gets more people and say, "Hey, I'll pay you a fair wage." And they knew they were 3 hours into the day. They understood that. But he said, "I'll pay you a fair wage." They were like, "That's fine, we'll go." So then another 3 hours pass, picks up more people, another 3 hours pass. And then he picks up people just 1 hour before closing time, if you will. And so that's this story where Jesus takes this time to explain this vineyard worker that comes, or vineyard workers that come at the end of the day. The sun's gone down. They're going to receive their day's wages. And they come to the table, the center where the money's going to be passed out. I imagine a table with the foreman sitting there handing over the wages. And you see them receive an entire day's wage for 1 hour's work. And the shock that they would have received, that wasn't expected. That wasn't normal. That's not like this happened a lot. That Jesus is telling us this shocking story. And so the disciples are like, what kind of vineyard owner, what kind of landowner would pay someone a full day's wages for 1 hour's work? They could have gotten so much more done. That doesn't make any sense on this earth. No one on earth would do that. And then you see Jesus saying in the same story, this parable he's telling, this story that he's telling, you see him talk about the others came in who had been working longer and throughout the day. And it says that the owner said that they should all be paid a full day's wages. And they're like, "Come on, we were expecting to get more because you gave the guys that were here for an hour an entire day's wage. We were hoping for, 12 times this much." In essence, you see them looking at this process. And they're feeling that it's an injustice, and they're talking to the owner of the land, the one who's paying, that's handing out these paychecks, and he looks at them and says, that's not your choice. This is my choice. This is my land, my money, my system. This new system of payment is not your choice. You're just the workers. You're along for the journey. And is it not great that you earned a full day's wage? And is it not great that they earned a full day's wage? They can now go feed their families and care for their families. Is this not a good thing that occurred? And I think that it's a very I get what these guys are talking about. When you bust your butt, I come from a rural community. Man, I started out working for a dairy farm. I would ride my bicycle to a dairy farm. I started working there full time in the summers when I was 15. I went into the trades for many years before I got into this, this current nonprofit work I work in. it's, you look at people that just like, it feels like so much is handed to them, and you feel the injustice of it. So I can get how these guys were feeling. They're like, man, we were like just busting our butts for a whole day, and we're just getting the same as the guys who showed up at the last minute. And Jesus talks about this, and I think that where this ties into our story today, there's a lot of principles I think you can draw from this. But I want to move away from the money thing, because money is a thing I find money, I don't have another word for it, but yucky. People get weird, systems get messed up, people have attitudes about money. But what Jesus is talking about here is a different system. And in fact, he's actually referencing this new way of moving away from a religion that's like, if you do these good things, if you work your whole life doing these good things, you're a better person. You get more out of this. You have more benefit in life from these things. He moves from that kind of standard human thinking, and he says, no, like this is not the way it is anymore. Those who come last will receive the same as those who are here first. It's not anymore about what you do as the worker, what you do as the follower of this religion, of this system that is in place that controls people's lives. And it's like you migrate from here to here, you grow up in the system, you're the good person, you're the better person, you're the person that's a priest. That is now gone, is what Jesus is saying. And I think that, man, like, I grew up in a very religious family, and so like I can understand this process of like going and doing all the right things, and then arriving at this space where when I see Jesus talking about this thing, he's saying all the good religious things that I did because they were the good religious things growing up don't actually mean anything in his system. Because it's no longer about what the worker is doing or has done. It's about Jesus and what he is doing and what he has done. This religious value that was given to works and actions and deeds, it's not about that anymore. It's about the owner. It's about the controller. This is the Lord. The one who actually controls everything is now what it's about. It's off from us. And this is a new way of thinking about stuff. This is not a natural human expectation to be like, I do the most work, but you know I don't get any different benefit than someone else. That's even saying that feels like wrong to me. That idea that like someone else can benefit from it. But Jesus is talking about a system where the most powerful in the world, the most powerful in that community or that culture are now in this place of, you don't get anything special from God because you're a powerful person on this earth. Because you have more money, because you have more resources, because you have a better education, you have a better family background. All that doesn't mean anything in God's new system. It's all about what God is doing, what Jesus is doing in this exact situation that actually matters. So when we look at our lives, and I want to bring this to us right now, like I think that we can look at our lives and we can build systems around us that we're like, if we do these things, we're good people. If we do these things, we're good family. If we do these things, we're better. We have political systems, we have religious systems, we have family culture systems, we have broader culture systems of a country, of a community. We have so many things that we want to do to make us better than others, or that we think make us better than others, and that we're more deserving. And what Jesus says here is that like that's not his system. He chooses who's deserving. And in fact, we see that, like you see that over and over again, that the idea that those who are first will be last, the idea that I have come to serve, not to be served. This flips it on its head. The one who is in authority is to be served. Everything happens around them. They decide what happens, and then others do it. And Jesus is saying, look at how I've come. If one believes that Jesus is God on earth, that he was born as a baby, was raised up in the nation of Israel. I mean, there was a time where he fled to Egypt early in his life, but like essentially grew up in the Jewish system, to Jewish parents, Jewish community. He grew up in that system. But if one believes that like this is God himself doing it, he has absolute authority and power, and yet he lives his adult life, the life that we see recorded in the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the things that people actually talk about, even though it was just a short portion of his actual life on earth. The portion that's recorded, we see him serving. He's not demanding and commanding anyone. He's serving. He's making himself submissive to a tyrannical Roman government that literally would, not far in the future, annihilate the Jewish nation as it existed. The one that had come in and conquered them with an incredible army that the world had never seen. He submits himself to that. Like, if we're believing that this is God himself, the idea that like he's submitting himself to this Caesar, to this earthly being, or he submits himself to the Jewish system. You see, he paid the temple tax. So back a few chapters, I think it was 17, where you see Jesus like paying the temple tax and being like, yeah, it's where I live. It's how I gather in community. So I'm going to choose to work in that. Jesus has shown over and over again that those who want to lead in this new system must do it through service. It's less of a system of I command and to a system of I exemplify. Do this like me. That's a change. This is a huge change. And we talk about it like in global systems and in company systems right now. They're talking about servant leadership versus traditional authoritarian leadership. And this is a huge fight in major corporations right now. How is best to lead people? It happens in sports teams. You have these different types of leaders that are captains on sports teams. And they talk about the different ways they lead. And so this is not something new. This is not something old that doesn't happen anymore. This is a system. But Jesus says in his system, and the way that God is going to work now, this is the way to follow the teaching of Jesus, is to become a servant if you want to lead. And if you want to be a leader in the world system, you're serving something else. That's the new way. And so I think it's a pretty wild juxtaposition of especially for the Jewish people. They were told by Moses that if they did these things right, that they would have command over this whole land and that they would be the ultimate authority. And they did that. Like through the times of David, King David and King Solomon, under those Jewish kings, they were immensely powerful. No one could tell them what to do. They were able to tell everyone else what to do. So it's not like that's the old way. And Jesus is saying something new is happening. The new leaders will have to be servants. If you're going to be in God's way, if you're going to be in God's system, this is the way it's going to be. So then Jesus jumps into this idea of his death again. And so we saw back a few chapters again, we saw Jesus went up onto the mountain with 3 of the disciples. And they saw him in what's like, the technical term is a transfiguration, or there's some other terminology you can use. The idea that Jesus was in the very presence of God the Father. There's a bright light, his face shone. Like there's this immensely powerful experience that these 3 guys had, and they saw Jesus for what he really was, true Messiah. Like this changing of the guard that was happening, this new covenant that was coming. Nothing like this had happened in their experience, or even their great-grandfather's experience. No one had seen anything like this forever. And they were there to experience it. And so then at the end of that, he tells the 3, hey, don't forget, I'm going to be dying soon, and I'm going to be raised again 3 days. In chapter 20, in verse 17 through 19, Jesus does the same thing. He talks about this, but he takes all 12, and he takes them aside and said, hey, I'm going to go up into Jerusalem. I'm going to die. And it's not going to be pretty. In fact, he explains it. He says, they'll hand me over to the Romans to be mocked, whipped, and crucified. But on the 3rd day, he'll be risen from the dead. There's this actual situation where Jesus is talking about dying to the 12, his closest 12. And he's saying it's going to be in the worst, most humiliating, most excruciating method of torturous death that they could understand. This is where you see him talking about it. And so it's not a small thing. Even though it's a small section of this chapter, Jesus is dropping these hints to these guys, saying this is going to happen. He's trying to prepare them for this process because this is shocking. Again, their leader, their rabbi, this one who does so much good, that says he's going to establish a new way of life on earth, saying that he's going to die. There's an immense amount of confusion here. But then Jesus jumps right into having this conversation with the mom of two of the disciples. And I don't know how much time passed between this. It's kind of one of those things where you're like, this must have been a while past that, because it's like that would be kind of awkward to be like, hey, I'm going to die a horrible, excruciating, torturous death. And then like the two guys' mom shows up and he's like, hey, I want my guys in your kingdom, when all is said and done. But the mother of James and John shows up and she says, like, I want my two sons to sit at places of honor in your kingdom. So like at your right and left hand. And if you've ever seen like some of the monarchies of Europe and other places of the world, often you'll have like the different members of the court sitting on the sides of the monarch. And so it's kind of that image of like, hey, I want one on your left and one on your right. Like, my boys, like I love them and I want them to be, powerful and strong in your kingdom. And this is when Jesus jumps into this idea of talking about this is a new way. And you don't know what you're asking, because what I'm going to experience, the cup I'm going to drink from, this, again, a royal imagery of like the royal goblet and all these things that would be shared, or this special wine that would only be shared amongst the monarchy and all this thing. So much there, but he's talking about this idea of sharing in this suffering that he's going to experience. And they're like, no, we're ready to do it. And he's like, okay, it's true. And actually we do see in history, and we see later on in their stories, if you follow tradition or even some of the writings of Scripture talk about some of these guys' death, and they actually follow the teachings of Christ so much that they follow in his example of these pretty terrible, excruciating deaths. And they were so willing to live that different life and so willing to look like their teacher, Jesus, that they actually moved to like experience very similar things to what he did. Or Peter wasn't mentioned here, but he died crucified upside down. He's like the tradition holds that he said, I understand I'm going to be crucified, but will you crucify me upside down so that because I don't feel worthy to be crucified like the Lord Jesus. And so Jesus is saying, like, do you guys realize what you're getting into? And that's when he talks about, it's right here in verses 25 through. But Jesus called them together and said this. So he got all the disciples. They were mad. The other 10 were kind of like, how come this guy gets like special treatment? Like, because their mom came and talked to them. And so the 10 came and they're like, what's up with these guys? What's going on? And Jesus kind of calms them, brings them together and says, like, in this world, kings are tyrants, and officials lord it over the people beneath them. But among you, it should be quite different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. For even I, the Son of Man, come here not to be served, but to serve others and give my life as a ransom for many. And he lays it out for them again, and I know I just talked about this, but I mean, just imagine our world leaders willing to sacrifice their desires, their wants, their needs for the people around them. It's not something we see commonly. People love power. People love control. That's natural. I love those things. Like, you really get down to it, I love to be in control of my life and in control of what's going on around me. I love to have power and authority over what's occurring in my life. It's a constant struggle. In this new way of life that Jesus is talking about, this idea of the leaders being the most subservient. In fact, being a slave, the idea of being, like, the greatest will actually be a slave. The idea that you get nothing out of it. You don't even get wages out of it. This idea of, like, slaving for a master that you have no control over. Jesus is saying those who are like that those will be the greatest. This is so in contrast to human thinking and human behavior of anything I've ever seen. And so it comes down to this, and I was kind of like, oh, this is like weird. This is kind of like just a little like thumbtack, like a little sticky note kind of thing on the end. But I like that the chapter ends like this. It says, as Jesus and the two disciples, this is verse 29, as Jesus and the two disciples, I'll stop. I'm getting too rushed here. Verse 29, as Jesus and the two disciples left the city of Jericho, a huge crowd followed behind. 2 blind men were sitting beside the road. When they heard that Jesus was coming that way, they began shouting, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. The crowd told them to be quiet, but they only shouted louder, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. Jesus stopped in the road and called, what do you want me to do for you? Lord, they said, we want to see. Jesus felt sorry for them and touched their eyes. Instantly they could see, and they followed him. I don't think it's just a sticky note add-on to this, that like Jesus, like this chapter ends. Jesus knows he's headed up to Jerusalem for his final days, some of his final times with his disciples and those he's been teaching and living with, the ones he loved and cared about so much. And what's happening is he's walking along, and there's these 2 blind guys, they say, that here he's coming, and they're begging for his help. And Jesus takes that time when, in human terms, he had every right to be focused on what was going to occur. Like, if you know when you're going to die, you live your last days differently. I've known people that have been through cancer and ALS and different things, and I have a dear family member who's going into a state of dementia that they know that they will be forgetting their family members and loved ones. And they haven't even ruled out ALS on top of the dementia. It's a terrifying thing. And this family member took this last Christmas and asked for people to gather together so that they could see and remember again, like one last time kind of thing. When we know the end is coming, we live differently as humans. And Jesus knows the end is coming in that same way, in that same pure way. He's been talking about it. And yet he takes time. And he says, when people are shouting at them to shut up, like the master's coming through, just shut up, okay? He's already told us he's going to die. There's a lot going on here. You know, James and John, their mom made a whole thing, and now we're kind of fighting, and he kind of rebuked us, and just shut up, okay? Like, Jesus is going through enough. We're going through enough. And Jesus stops, and he says, what do you want me to do for you? He shows this example. He doesn't dive into his humanity and be like, yeah, you know what? I'm going through a lot right now. I'm just going to keep my head down and keep moving. He stops. He sees a way to serve, and he serves them. And what happens? 2 more people follow him. This way of Jesus has a way of attracting people to it. And we love it when people care about us and people serve. We love seeing that as human beings. It's hard for us to do it, but we love to experience it when people take care of us, when people treat us special, when we don't deserve it. Shoot, when you just have someone at the till at the grocery store that treats you like a friend, even though you don't know them from Adam, you walk away feeling better about yourself and your day and your life. Just because they took time to treat you well and serve you, you feel better. So it's not a human nature thing. It's a discipline. It's an action that we do. But Jesus takes this time, and he says again, the greatest among you has to be to the point of enslaved to others' needs. They're more important than yourself. So as you go into this week, I don't know what that looks like for you. I don't know your life. I don't know everything about what you guys are going through, what you friends are experiencing in your family and life. But I know that this is something that we all can grow in. None of us are perfect. But we need to look to a new system, a new way. And this new way is servanthood. And so let's think about how we do that. When we engage with others, let's evaluate. Are we serving others or are we serving ourselves? Who's most important in this situation? Who does Jesus say that we're supposed to be giving this energy that we have? What energy we have in our lives is limited. And so who does Jesus' evaluation of life tell us that we're supposed to be giving this energy to. Anyway, let's pray and close up here. Hey, God, thank you for your word. Thank you for this idea that we have to live different than human nature wants to, and that you recognize that there's struggle and work to do in it. And even like the 12 that were closest to you were struggling to understand how someone who was the leader could serve. They saw you do it every day. They saw you living this, and they record it. Many of them wrote about it, and yet still, how much do we struggle to understand that your system is different? We're to be servants to all. So we pray for strength and wisdom, that can be something in us that drives that, for the discipline to choose to do what we can to serve others. In your name, amen. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.